I'm Big Don Luka, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
We are coming to you guys in light of the Derrick Jones Jr. news. He has recently signed with the Dallas Mavericks on a $2.7 million fully guaranteed veterans minimum deal per Shams Charania of The Athletic as of, I guess now, yesterday. It does seem like the news is very recent for whatever reason, though, because there's been an extreme dry spell of anything Mavericks related, really probably going on about a month or so now, maybe barring, moves around the fringes that the Mavericks made the other day, which we'll get into a little bit as well. They brought in some more guys for training camp, wings, Greg Brown III and Jake Wieskamp. So we'll be getting into that a little bit as well. The Mavericks now have 21 technical roster spots filled out of 20. Not all of those, of course, are fully guaranteed, but they obviously at least have to waive JaVale McGee or somebody else before heading into training camp or make some sort of consolidation trade. So we'll be getting into a little bit of that in today's podcast as well, touch up on current events, just kind of talk about where the Mavericks are in regard to the scope of the league. Because, we've been waiting weeks, really since free agency ended, but it does seem like the trade market is going to heat up sometime soon. Maybe not, if this week or the week after, at least before training camp, because it's not like these moves can be on standby forever. Obviously, if the Blazers want to take Damian Lillard and the 76ers want to take James Harden into the regular season, they can do that and then try to prevail through a disgruntled scenario with both of those guys. But we've seen more often than not, even if something is at a stalemate all offseason, if there is a strong push to get that deal done and the player, doesn't want to be there and there was a formal trade request with a big player, more often than not, we saw it a couple years ago with James Harden leaving Houston to Brooklyn, Donovan Mitchell saga last year, of course, with the Jazz front office obviously trying to get off him after they traded Gobert. I think more often than not, those type of players will at least get moved before training camp's over. So, the door is definitely not out on the Mavericks being able to get involved on like maybe a 3-team trade or, taking back a salary that a team, can't withstand because they're taking back another player in a different trade. So we will definitely, sprinkle and touch up on all, things, Mavs, news, rumors related that have came over, the last few days, even really weeks here today on this podcast. But of course, the main focus will definitely be the Derrick Jones Jr. signing. We'll obviously talk a little bit about his fit and stuff and, the excitement in regards to how he could fit with the Mavericks and, also what he, may have as in terms of some of his weaknesses and, why we should, obviously be excited for this signing, but, keep our expectations to a certain threshold too, because, it's not like the Mavericks went out and made a huge marquee move and got like PJ Washington or Clint Capella here, but they definitely did help around the margins quite a bit with this Derrick Jones Jr. signing the other day. But barring that, Jaren, what do you got? It's been a while since we've been on here.
It has been a while since we've been on here. Yeah, I mean, outside of the occasional training camp invite and outside, of course, this Derrick Jones Jr. news, there's been pretty dry in terms of really just NBA news in general. I do know that FIBA is heating up, and I forget when that does exactly begin, but been keeping up with that a little bit. And, I would be surprised if a trade regarding Damian Lillard and James Harden, of course, is not made kind of before training camp and FIBA all kick off all at once, really. So, I expect everything to kind of unfold within the next, say 3 weeks, I would say. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to really just basketball being back. It's been too long, and to say that it's only been about 4 weeks, but it's been too long since we've had anything really of significance happen in basketball. But Derrick Jones Jr., of course, excites a little bit and ignites a little bit more flames. And of course, gets people talking, which we like. So, I'm excited to see what his fit is, potentially with Luka and Kyrie, of course. And, he did play a lot more minutes than I think people realize. And of course, we'll dive into this a little bit more as the podcast gets along. But I think that he could have a bigger role, in my opinion. I think he could have a bigger role than people expect.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you, especially given the void right there at the Mavericks wing position. There's, a lot of minutes to be filled between, Olivier Maxence Prosper, Grant Williams, as well as Derrick Jones Jr. And seeing how those, particularly between Prosper and Derrick Jones Jr. split up, is going to be a really interesting development to me, because I think that given, where Derrick Jones Jr. is at in this stage in his career, he's a really athletic wing, great defender, especially as an on-ball defender. Obviously off ball, he does have his inconsistencies every once in a while that we'll get into in this podcast, but really good on-ball defender, obviously really athletic, he even played as a 5 for the Bulls at times last year. So, he can work well as the roll man, given his insane verticality throughout different points in the game, given the opponent's lineup. But there's a lot of different interesting ways in which the Mavericks can use him. But one thing that obviously has been probably the biggest sort of inhibition, in regards to him over his NBA career is obviously his 3-point shooting. And, seeing how, his 3-point shooting translates on the Mavericks, as well as how Omax looks from 3, day one, I think will definitely dictate the minute battle between those two. So that's going to be very intriguing to see how those two, split up the minutes there. But barring that, we're just going to go ahead and get into the intro here. But before we do that, we do want to make sure that you guys are staying posted with all sorts of the, content that we are getting out at this moment. Jaren and I are obviously writing over at the Smoking Cuban, so you can catch all of our new articles over there. We, me and Jaren specifically didn't post an article about Derrick Jones Jr., but there is an article on the website over there if you guys want to get more, a little bit in-depth coverage in regards to what his fit on the Mavericks would look like. We definitely recommend that you go check that out. And we've posted some articles as well. Jaren just posted an article about Derek Lively and, what his fit and ceiling is going to look like in Dallas. So definitely, go check that out if you want to sort of prelude to what he's going to, look like this upcoming year, because he may play, some games with the legends at the start. And, Jaren touches up on that heavily in the article, just sort of what his developmental track could look like this season. And, I got an article coming out, I believe actually at 5 today, in regards to Dirk Nowitzki's Hall and Frame enshrinement and some fellow Mavericks that will be in attendance to that. So, there's a lot of different little sprinkles of news that have been coming out, but there's not like one major thing, for us to really cover and hone in on. So we're going to be kind of all over the place on this podcast, but we'll definitely put an emphasis on the Derrick Jones Jr. stuff, like I said. And, also, like you had mentioned, Jaren, we will definitely at least briefly cover Luka's World Cup preparation games with Slovenia. Probably won't go fully in depth. I did not have a chance to watch the second game versus Greece, nor the game versus Montenegro, but I did watch the first game versus Greece, and I was able to watch the full game highlights of that game versus Montenegro. So, ahead of World Cup play, which will start August 26th for Slovenia versus Venezuela, there's a lot of good Luka stuff coming out right now. I mean, he's in excellent shape. He's playing extremely well. And while it's certainly not a tell-all for how this upcoming season is going to be for him in the Mavericks, it definitely, gives us a sort of basis to work with in terms of how, Luka's increased explosiveness and stamina could translate, when the Mavericks head into training camp. And on top of that, obviously the World Cup, games themselves are going to be just fascinating to watch from a competitive standpoint. And, one of Slovenia's last exhibition, preparation games, if you will, is going to be versus the USA this Saturday, August 12th, same day that Dirk gets enshrined into the Hall of Fame. So it's like a great sort of day for Mavericks fans, or I guess just the sort of ebb and flow and stuff of, coming up for Mavericks fans is kind of nice right now, given how dry it's been. But none of it is too, I guess I'm not going to say highly important, because I'm definitely not going to, disregard Dirk in that aspect, but none of it's too crazy or too groundbreaking in terms of the news that's really been coming out. But it in terms of the Hall of Fame stuff for Dirk, that's something we'll get into this podcast a little bit, but it's obviously really excited. You got to give him his flowers in any area of gratitude of basketball that we can. And I mean, that is the single-handedly the biggest accomplishment you can get as a basketball player. So it'll be a really cool event and scene to cap off Dirk's wide array of retirement activities that he's been invested in the last few years in terms of getting honored in Dallas, even though he has to not accept it begrudgingly, but he's always embarrassed having to go up and talk and everything like that. So it'll be a fun thing. But make sure you are keeping up with all our stuff on the Smoking Cuban, as well as the podcast, of course. And you can also follow our Twitter at mainstream214 and see all of our tweets and stuff, up to date right when something happens. That's usually the first forum that we'll go share our immediate thoughts on before any podcast or any articles drop. So make sure you guys check us out on there as well. But without further ado, we will go ahead and get into this podcast. But before we do that, here's an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters. All right, Jaren. So obviously, after the Dallas Mavericks missed out on Matisse Thybulle in restricted free agency and the Portland Trailblazers signed that offer sheet, there was still sort of a need there to, accrue another backup wing that, of course, can, is versatile on defense, can defend multiple positions potentially, as well as a guy that, can provide something on offense, whether it's shooting, whether it's playmaking or, X, Y, and Z, right? Just as long as they're not completely, just one dimensional. Obviously, the Dallas Mavericks weren't able to get, maybe a marquee guy in that aspect, to add on to Grant Williams at that wing position, another true definite starter like a PJ Washington, just because there really wasn't availability of that degree on the market. But they still did address their, the wing position furthermore this offseason, even after getting Olivier Maxence Prosper, even after bringing in Grant Williams with the Derrick Jones Jr. signing. And they didn't even use any of their MLE, I believe. It's just fully on a minimum deal per Shams Charania. So did you think that the Mavericks would even be making this move this far into the offseason? Because there had obviously been rumors of Jalen Noel, Derrick Jones Jr., Kelly Oubre, but all these guys included. But everything kind of seemed like it wouldn't come into fruition until after, some of these trades were settled. Given this is more of a kind of move around the fringes compared to what the Mavericks would need to do to address their center position. But were you surprised that this happened at the time it did? Just given the general lack of news with the Mavericks recently?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was a notification that popped up on my phone that I surely wasn't expecting. I wasn't necessarily expecting the Mavericks to be making a move after a trade. I don't think that they were necessarily waiting on that sort of, big move to be made. I just think that the Mavericks kind of buying time, seeing what the market gave them. Clearly, Derrick Jones Jr. was, maybe not best available, but he was probably best available for the team's needs. They went and picked him up, obviously. And yeah, we're sitting here today with a 21 or 22 man roster at this current point. So if anything, I think that move almost stirred up a trade at some point this season. I think that it's likely going to be a 2-for-1 trade. But yeah, back to your question, I necessarily wasn't expecting it, like I said, but the fact that it popped up, and I mean, it definitely makes me a little bit more steady minded, or at least maybe not I think it answers a lot of question marks. It's another athletic wing, defensive minded wing that is that you can kind of check off the boards. This team last year was definitely in dire need of wings like Derrick Jones Jr., and they went and got him on that minimum deal. So I'm really excited to see what he can do. But yeah, I necessarily wasn't expecting it. I was on my drive back, and had been driving for about 2 hours, and it just randomly popped up. And it was surely interesting, something, of course, like I said, that I wasn't expecting. But Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be something to watch going forward. Is necessarily like what the Mavericks do with him, and not just that, but how much minutes he's going to get. You know, in Chicago, and even in Miami, you know, he saw a little bit more playing time than I think people expected. I think we could see a similar situation in Dallas. You know, his ability to kind of play almost 3 through 4 or 3 through 5 rather, is gonna make him an interesting like sort of player. I think that, you know, if you don't want Maxi playing the sole five and say a sort of, you know, bench five lineup, you know, I think that he could spot some minutes there. It's not saying that he's going to be that sure five lineup off the bench, but I really think that there is some flexibility now that Derrick Jones Jr. gives the Dallas Mavericks. And like I said, you know, there's going to be some interesting things that we can do with this lineup now. But yeah, you know, one thing's for certain, we did get a defensive wing. You know, he's not going to be paired in that starting lineup with Luka and Kyrie and Grant Williams. He's not going to be a guy like that. But he's going to come off the bench, maybe alongside Omax Prosper, and probably create a dynamic duo with those two off the bench defensively around the wings. So I'm really looking forward to it. I think headed into training camp, it now creates a lot more questions on, you know, that last two-way spot because, of course, Dexter Dennis, you know, Miles McBride, all these different
Mike
number of
Miles,
guys.
Mike Miles.
Mike Miles. Yeah, I don't know why I said Miles McBride, but Mike Miles. There's definitely a lot of guys now that are sort of pining for that last two-way spot. You know, Mike Miles, of course, is on a two-way right now, but that isn't guaranteed. So I think it's going to be interesting going into training camp who is pining for that last roster spot. And I mean, like I said, you know, there's a lot of different names that could be sort of going after that spot. So we'll see what happens, but I'm really excited for that signing. I know a lot of people are questioning it, saying, you know, it's really just a minute signing. Why are we getting hype? But this is the first time that the Mavericks are sort of signing for needs, at least in recent years. And like I said, you know, it just makes me excited. Derrick Jones Jr. is going to jump out of the gym, and to see him alongside Luka, potentially being on the other side of that lob pass, could be absolutely lethal for other teams in terms of off the bench. So I'm excited.
Yeah, definitely. I was pretty taken aback at the news, even though, you know, it's not obviously the biggest bit of news that you can get right off the bat. But I was at work and I just saw the top half of the notification appear from Twitter, or X, I guess now. And it said Shams Charania is reporting Derrick Jones Jr. is signing a 1-year fully guaranteed contract with, and then I was like, oh shoot, let's see if it's the Mavericks. And I opened Twitter and it was. So that was a validating experience from that perspective. But I think the reason that it took me aback a little bit was like literally just because like 2 days previously, the Mavericks obviously had brought I believe it was Joe Wieskamp and Greg Brown III in on those contracts. And at that point, I'm like, okay, they fully filled out, the training camp roster at the very least. And I do think that between Dexter Dennis, Wieskamp, as well as Greg Brown III, and Taze Moore, rather, as well as Jelly Walker, you know, one of those five guys is probably going to get that last two-way spot, unless the Mavericks see something in another, from another preseason or G League guy here as training camp ensues before the regular season kicks off, where they're like, okay, that's enough for us to give this guy, potentially a guaranteed deal, or he definitely has earned our two-way, far and ahead of, these five other guys. But they got five intriguing guys there that they're heading into training camp with. And I wouldn't say, while some of them definitely probably have a better chance at making the two-way ahead of others, I can't say that it's a situation, maybe like in years prior where we could maybe just kind of pencil in one of those guys to make the two-way. So I definitely think that they're going to go into training camp and battle all of it out. And that's, going to be really intriguing to see. But furthermore, the reason that, the Derrick Jones Jr. Signing specifically surprised me was because, once the Mavericks brought in Greg Brown III, I mean, he's essentially like early career Derrick Jones Jr. Like he's that archetype, that mold of player. And I was honestly, pretty surprised that they just brought in Derrick Jones Jr. on that guaranteed deal right after that, after bringing in, a guy, such similar ilk in, Greg Brown III. So I mean, obviously, the more the merrier. Derrick Jones Jr. is actually proven. We know that he can help day one. Obviously, Greg Brown, the third, his offensive game and, some of the inconsistencies with being in the right spot on defense obviously have, limited his developmental track a little bit in the NBA. And he's sort of had a, weird route to the league after being, pretty highly coveted in high school. So, I do like the fact that the Mavericks are adding more of a surefire guy that's going to be ready to help day one in terms of getting out in transition. Occasionally being able to be a spot up shooter, even though he just shot, I believe a hedge over 30%, if that, the last couple seasons from three. And a guy that, is going to be a really timely cutter. He's going to be able to plug and play in the offense. He's a, really good team player. You can set up, staggers for him to run, off this, where he can get lob passes. There's a lot of different actions that you can involve him with in the offense, in out of timeout scenarios when you're looking to get an easy bucket. He's a great guy for that, given how athletic he is. And I mean, we're poised to see, at least in training camp with this current Mavericks training camp roster, even if they cut some of those, really athletic guys from training camp, like this is still going to be one of the more athletic rosters we've had in years from the Mavericks after they ranked 28th in pace last year and, have sort of been, I wouldn't say plagued, but the Luka era has definitely been riddled with, half court centric and dominated offense. And, the Mavericks do look good when the right guys get out in transition, as we've seen with like Josh Green, Jaden Hardy last year. But now they have the wherewithal to maybe be able to facilitate that a little bit more. And it's going to be up to Luka and, of course, Kyrie, but he's always been good at this, but especially Luka to, really push the ball when need be in the open court and get the ball out quick on outlet passes, more often off of long misses and turnovers this year, because the Mavericks have the ability to score a little bit more in transition. So they're going to need to exercise it more because, I mean, that's just the formula for winning basketball right there. Getting easy buckets. Of course, that's not as easy as that, given it's clearly the NBA, but that's what the Mavericks have to do if they want to translate defense into offense, at an increased clip this year. And they have, the ability to do it on both sides of that front for the first time in a long time. So that's why, I've been stressing in some of my articles recently, particularly with Luka and Slovenia, why him carrying over this increased, shape that he's in, him, looking a lot more emblematic of his 2019, 2020 self, is going to be paramount if the Mavericks are going to get in transition more next year. And even, back when Luka was in good shape, he was getting out in transition more, but it still probably wasn't at the clip that, you wanted. So just seeing how that evolves is definitely going to be an interesting development, because I think that could definitely, turn the tide of the Mavericks ceiling this year if they're going to be a good transition team, not even just on offense, but on both ends. I mean, Derrick Jones Jr., I mean, that's a guy that can get out and transition and make a chase down block if he really needs to. There's a lot more potential for stuff like that this year, and that's what makes all this exciting. But, conversely, Derrick Jones Jr. is also a guy that is, like we've talked about, is not, been the best staple of consistency throughout his NBA career. Has only really recently, over maybe the past 3 or 4 years, made a, spot where, he has planted his foot and, actually got a spot in a rotation consistently, kind of at that 8 or 9 man area for the Heat and the Bulls respectively over the last couple of years. So, if the 3-point shot comes into fruition at an increased rate, more than we think he's going to be able to, and the looks that he's getting off of Luka and Kyrie are, just so much more beneficial to him, and he's having all this, increased space and everything like that. I mean, this is a guy that I do think could potentially elevate into a starting caliber player for the Mavericks, but we do have to recognize that, look, like he's 27, maybe 28, I think now, and maybe even a tad bit older. And, despite as athletic as he is, I don't know how much more, development there is for him to do on that end. So if he can just be that baseline serviceable wing who can defend, 2 through 4 more specifically, but maybe even 5s at times, specifically fives who don't have near as good of a base or a lower body that he won't kind of get pushed around by. I think that will be huge for the Mavericks. And, just eliminating off-ball mistakes. I think a lot of that definitely will have to do with how synchronized this Mavericks team defense is together and how bought in everybody is. And, Jason Kidd obviously did a good job of that year one. So that was definitely a, major focus last year in terms of a lot of our better on-ball defenders, not necessarily playing up to par off-ball because maybe the scenario just didn't warrant it for them in that occasion for whatever reason. But if the team is fully bought in and, they're as uber competitive as we, would hope, then those effort plays around the margins and, staying attentive off ball will probably improve not just for Derrick Jones Jr., but for everybody else. So, Jaren and I have obviously talked about that the Mavericks were one wing and one center away from, true contention. And, while Derrick Jones Jr. maybe isn't, a starting caliber wing, I don't necessarily think he needs to be if the Mavericks are still able to get another center in terms of this being an A+ offseason where we addressed all areas of need. I don't think that Derrick Jones Jr. by himself, obviously thrust the Mavericks into contention or anything like that, but it definitely, makes their wing depth bolstered a lot more, and it's going to be a lot easier for Jason Kidd to divvy up the minutes between the wings next year, and it's just going to add a much more concentrated, defensive prowess on all fronts, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah, to touch up on that athleticism, the Mavericks, of course, throughout this whole entire offseason have gotten a lot more athletic with the addition of Omax, Derek Lively for obvious reasons, and then, of course, now Derrick Jones Jr. This team has really sort of, taken a complete 180 in terms of that, because like you said, they were 28th in pace last year, which is purely indicative on, how unathletic or really just a lack of unathleticism that this team had. And now, you add the guys that I just mentioned, this team now has, a really big sort of position that they're held in with the, they have a lot of wings now. There's a lot of guys that can make a name for themselves. So I'm interested to see what happens. But to speak more on Derrick Jones Jr., he shot 30% from three at a career, but he doesn't have a guy like Luka Doncic alongside of him. So I think that, if we're going to see an elevation in his 3-point shooting, it's going to be this year, if anything, because again, he's getting the ball from Kyrie Irving. He's getting the ball from Luka Doncic. And he's only going to get open shots. So I'm interested to see what exactly he can do from there and how he can improve his offensive game, because I think one thing's for certain, the lob threat ability is going to be there. I think he might even be one of the top lob threats on this Mavericks roster now. But to see him improve his 3-point shot would only elevate his game. He could potentially become a legit rotational guy on this roster if he could somehow elevate that. And of course, this is going into La La Land, hoping, for the best and all this. But, there is a legit opportunity for him to increase and to improve that 3-point shot alongside Luka. As I said, he doesn't have a guy or hasn't had a guy like Luka throughout his career. I mean, the best players he's played with, Jimmy Butler for a season, Damian Lillard, and Devin Booker. And DeMar DeRozan and Zach LaVine. Those are pretty much about it. He doesn't have a big list of guys that, are all NBA first teams outside of Damian Lillard. So I'm really interested to see what he can do alongside Luka and how he can improve his game for obvious reasons. But yeah, there's not just that. There's also other guys in the training camp. Joe Wieskamp,
I do want to touch up on what you said though really quickly.
Yeah, of course.
In regards to Derrick Jones Jr., I don't even necessarily think though that the caliber of those players necessarily is what will give him more open looks in Dallas. I think that it's the size and the attention in which Luka draws, and his ability to find guys cross court and precarious positions, like for easy looks. Like there's not a lot of guys that have the ability to see over the defense and play make like that. I mean, even Dame and Devin Booker. Potentially, you can make the argument, Dame, Devin Booker, that even if they're not obviously on the level of Luka, that they're in that category, like right under him. He's played with some good players throughout his career, no doubt, but not a dynamic guy, of the caliber of Luka, who can get him the ball in all sorts of different positions, whether it be making a 45 cut from the wing, going back door, or obviously like just across the perimeter. If he's getting double teamed, halfway across the court, like there's just a lot of different options from that perspective with any spot up shooter and Luka Doncic. And the Mavericks have obviously bolstered their shooting a little bit this offseason, but I mean, there will be some question marks off the bench. That's undeniable. I think that Omax and Derrick Jones Jr. shooting could definitely turn the tide of any juncture in this season if they're both shooting hot at the same time. That would give the Mavericks a guarantee of at least like competent shooting game to game, even if certain guys are having an off night. If those guys can at least, prove to be league average, but that'll definitely, be a big question mark going into next season, no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, like you said, if Omax and if Derrick Jones Jr., I'm just going to start saying DJJ because it's a lot. It's a mouthful. But if Omax and DJJ can somehow, get on a hot streak of shooting or shoot, best career percentages, I guess for DJJ, that's the case for him. But if they can somehow shoot at a confident rate, I really think it's going to be very hard for this team to lose, especially if those two guys off the bench are, like we said, shooting at a very high clip. But yeah, to transfer back or to transition back into kind of the lower end guys like Greg Brown III, Joe Wieskamp, these are some of the guys that are, pining to make that last roster spot. Jelly Walker, who was the other one? It was Tajay Moore. Like these are some of the guys that, are outside shots to make the roster. And it's going to be a battle headed into training camp. I'm really excited to see it. I think anytime you can have a positional battle where, 5 guys essentially are battling for one position, there's going to be anticipation. There's going to be some fun things that are going to happen. And I know last year, NBA TV, I believe it was, did that whole, inside practice thing with the Mavericks. I don't know if they're bringing that back this year, but if they do, I hope it is with the Mavericks. Because again, even though they aren't sort of, guys that are going to move the needle necessarily, these are guys that would be fun to watch, of course, battle out for that last position. And, to touch up on Wieskamp, I honestly forgot that he even signed with us a few days ago, but he was a former 4-star recruit at the University of Iowa. I believe he's 6'6", and he played for San Antonio and Toronto at one point in time, and actually dropped 28 points in the, I think, latest summer league game for Toronto, where he had a not career high, but I think he shot like 4 for 5 from 3. So he's definitely much more of a wing kind of guy, more offensive talented, more offensive minded than defense, that is. So, I think that if the Mavericks are looking forward or looking to go that defensive route more, that offensive route more in the shooting direction, he could be a potential target. But I think, in terms of him and Greg Brown III, those are probably the more outside shot guys, maybe even Tajay Moore if you want to throw him in there. But it'll definitely be interesting, like I said, and I'm looking forward to it. And I think headed into training camp, there's going to be a lot of questions that are answered, not just regarding that final roster spot, but also the starting center position possibly. Are the Mavericks going to make a move headed into training camp regarding that starting position or starting center position? I think that there's a lot of questions that will be answered that we just don't know the answer to right now. But I'm, like I said, definitely looking forward to it.
Yeah, to touch up off what you said, I want to pose a question to everybody in the audience. And if you're on Spotify, you will be able to actually see this on the screen, I believe, at some juncture if you're listening on the podcast. But what do you guys think the Mavericks will do with their last two-way spot? Who do you think they'll sign out of those 5 guys? Jelly Walker, Tajay Moore, Greg Brown III, Joe Wieskamp, and I'm forgetting one more. Tell me out, Jaren.
Yeah, you said Greg Brown III, Joe Wieskamp. This is pretty bad right here.
Oh, Dexter Dennis.
Dexter Dennis, yes.
Yes, between those 5, who do you think the Mavericks will sign for their two-way spot? Let us know down in the comments on YouTube if you're listening on that as well. But Jaren, who do you think the Mavericks will sign with that 5th roster spot? Because I will say I feel like all of those guys are in a pretty similar tier to each other. And, I don't know if I would put any one of them above, a threshold upon the other, maybe besides Jelly Walker, just because of his summer league performance. But then again, the other guys fit a position of need, obviously a lot more than him, given the Mavericks, egregious amount of guards right now after, signing Seth Curry this offseason and everything. I personally think that Greg Brown III has the best opportunity to get that spot, because if he comes in and is looking like, Derrick Jones Jr. 2.0 light, or whatever you want to call it, flashes some potential in the short roll, makes a couple threes during camp, is defending, getting out in transition, doing those kind of things. I think if his development looks a little bit more polished, he's still really young, came out of Texas really early. I think he has the best opportunity to get that spot, but I'm not necessarily saying whatsoever that he will get that spot. But he would definitely have the best opportunity to blossom there. Who do you think personally is going to get it?
Yeah, I might have to follow alongside with Greg Brown III, but I'll try and change it up a little bit. Assuming Mike Miles is kind of a lock at that final two-way spot, I think that kind of rules out Jelly Walker. Not saying that he's not going to be a part of the Mavericks organization, because I think he will be in some way and capacity a G League Texas legend. I think all these guys will be Texas legends out of all five. But, if I had to kind of go,
you never know, because like they don't bring all of them back usually, but
they don't usually bring all of them back. But I really would be surprised if at least the highlight guys, maybe even Dexter Dennis, aren't in some way, like I said, a legend.
The newer guys especially, I would be surprised, because they definitely have a tendency to be like, okay, like we liked what we saw, we want to bring this back and see what we can get. A guy like Taze Moore, if he has a good training camp, for instance, and a good preseason, but the Mavericks, for whatever reason, just had a better guy, or they want to sign somebody else, I feel like a guy like him wouldn't be as inclined to come back to the Legends after he already played with them last year, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that's where, you get the questions. If he doesn't get that final two-way spot, is he going to be somewhere else? And yeah, I mean, the question could be yes, but I feel like, I kind of just have to go Greg Brown III. I think, like you said, he has the best opportunity to make that final two-way spot. I love Jelly Walker, and I still think that he will be a legend, like I said. I think Wieskamp will probably be a legend. I don't think he really has a real shot at making that two-way spot. He did in the season, or I guess had spots in the season last year where he ended it really well. He had a 10-point game against Milwaukee, and he actually had, like I said, that 28-point game in Summer League. So I think him would be kind of a question mark, but it would be interesting to see him, how he can kind of prove his point. Dexter Dennis, if he has any resemblance of offense and shooting, I mean, that could be a sneaky dark horse pick for that final two-way spot. But I just think safest and overall probably biggest bang for your buck has got to be Greg Brown III, just because, again, I mean, I think he's only like 23.
If that, I got to check how old he is.
Yeah, I think he's like 22 or 23, struggling to make a name for himself in the league. But definitely, if that's the guy that pops, I mean, heck, sky's the limit. I think I don't know if he was a first or second. I believe he was a second-round pick. But yeah, I mean, sky's the limit. I think he was like a five-star recruit headed into college. So I think if he does, like I said, resemble anything of consistency, that's a guy that could potentially become a rotational player later on down the road. Not saying this year at all, but if he does show some promise, he could later on down the road, like I said.
Funny, yeah. Greg Brown III is actually from Dallas, ironically enough, and he is only 21. He'll turn 22.
21, wow.
He'll only turn 22 on September 1st, so literally in like 20 days. But I mean, that's a pretty fresh 22. He'll be 22 literally the whole season. So, yeah, I mean, he's still very young, still has a lot of potential. And I mean, anytime you get a chance to get a homegrown guy, back in any capacity, it always is good, just from the perspective that if they do hit, they would probably be a lot more inclined to stay long-term, especially looking at a guy like Greg Brown III, and then Mike Miles Jr., even though I don't think he grew up in Dallas, obviously went to TCU. Guys like that, I mean, the Mavericks have, tried on in years past, and, had varying success kind of throughout the margins on, those homegrown products that end up, coming back to Dallas, or, finding their way there in some capacity that end up playing a little bit. But I do think that, given Greg Brown III's, athleticism, I mean, obviously, that in itself, along with the defensive intangibles, the wingspan, the potential, I mean, it just does bode a lot of credence to this being a really intriguing player if he can, sift through some of the inconsistencies of his game, like his shot, his playmaking ability, and just how, reliable he is game to game. That's going to be huge for him. So that's definitely an interesting wrinkle from, that perspective of what's going to happen with the last roster spot. And I'm sure we'll get into Derrick Jones Jr. fit a little bit more when, we do our player previews and stuff all like that before the season, which we're excited for. But, in this one, we obviously just wanted to touch base strictly on the news aspect of things and, dive into a little bit of, how excited we were about the signing, as well as what, it could do for the Mavericks, as far as their, team goes. How much are they going to improve from this? And I think lastly, Jaren, before we get on to, some more tertiary topics and things of that nature, do you think that the Derrick Jones Jr. signing elevates the Mavericks to a contender? Do you think that it elevates their letter grade this offseason? How much does this make the team better? Because we obviously kind of talked around it, but we didn't really say it definitively.
Yeah, we were actually talking off air. And I think that me and you would both grade this offseason or a pre Derrick Jones Jr. signing as a B plus, and I think that probably elevates into an A minus. Something that doesn't move the needle, but definitely something that you
Raises
definitely
the
improve
floor.
around the. What'd you say?
Raises the floor.
Yeah, raises the floor. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a high flyer kind of guy. If he does hit, it would be amazing. If he doesn't, it's a 1 year, what was it, $2.7 million contract. So nothing crazy. I do want to pose this question to the audience real quick. What would you grade this offseason? This is, of course, pre-center, assuming they do trade for a center. But right now, what would you grade this offseason? They've made some pretty big additions, including Derrick Jones Jr. So I'm excited to see what the answers are. But yeah, I would probably say an A minus. What would you say?
I would probably go with an A minus as well. But it's a weird because I don't think that, obviously this move single-handedly thrusts the Mavericks into contention. But, the reason I say that it raises their floor is because they get another, somewhat high quality, role player at a position of need. And what's separating the Mavericks at this juncture isn't necessarily their depth, because, the kind of guys that they're coming into camp with, like they do have technically like a lot of positional depth, especially if they, we don't even know exactly what's going to happen, with JaVale McGee, but it has been reported, earlier in the offseason that it's certain he will either get stretched waived, or just waived or traded. Right. So that's a guaranteed roster spot right there. That's going to be gone. So they do have other, ways to format this before it's all said and done. I mean, they could end up signing Greg Brown or maybe AJ Lawson outright and then like put one of those guys at the two-way instead. Like they have a lot of flexibility with this here, which, almost, bodes credence to the fact that maybe two of those guys that we, listed as potential suitors for two ways could be sticking around on a two-way or a guaranteed contract. But I do think that, with the wing depth that they have now, I think that this does leaps and bounds for the floor of this team, because, a guy like Grant Williams or Omax is just going to be able to, get a little bit more rest. They're going to have more juice to defend, and be more versatile from that perspective and have more juice offensively. Right. I don't think that it's obviously the, marker that's preventing the Mavericks from reaching that contender status. I don't think that they just transcended that all of a sudden, but I do think that, I can confidently say the Mavericks are a top 7 seed now is what I would say. I think that there's no way that they end up going lower than 7 after, having signed Derrick Jones Jr. and bolstering the wing depth. I mean, it's just too much of a top to bottom, just organizational reset from a defensive perspective. Obviously, there's still a lot of question marks, especially with the youth and, kind of the inconsistencies of some of these players. They're not maybe the idealized guys that you would have, hoped for if you say, okay, Grant Williams, Omax, and Derrick Jones Jr. are the 3 wings heading into the next season. You would probably, like a little bit more offensive versatility and dynamism, between all 3 of those guys, if you're talking strictly from a contending perspective, right? And you look at some of these teams across the league, like with what Denver had last year, they had that. And, Caldwell Pope, Bruce Brown, Christian Braun, guys like that. And it's going to be interesting to see if the Mavericks, if Omax and, Jones Jr. are going to be able to thrust the Mavericks into that sort of sphere. But I will say I just feel like they have too much depth and they had enough defensive versatility to where I just can't see this team, barring injuries, dropping into the play-in. I think that they, or even if they do drop into the play-in, at that 7th spot, roughly, I think they're at least a top 7 seed after this, maybe 8, just given the West is so damn good. But if that's the case, I think it would have to be some sort of year like 2014-15, where literally every team had damn near 50 wins or something like that. So I think that this move at least puts the Mavericks out of, play-in stratosphere. Definitely cannot say with confidence that, it makes them a top 4 team now, but that's just my opinion in the West. What do you think, Jaren?
Yeah, I would probably, go in a similar route to you. I think, pre Derrick Jones Jr., I would honestly probably say it was a lock at, maybe not a lock, but I think that this team was an 8 seed at best. I would probably go more so in the route that I think that this elevates them into a 7th, potentially 6th best team, or 6th seed rather. But yeah, to follow up what you said, this team is nowhere near contention. I think that they still are in dire need of a starting caliber center to become that, potential contender that they could be. So I think that, it doesn't necessarily move the needle with this signing, but it does, sort of bolster up depth. It does sort of bolster up more of a floor, or more of a ceiling rather than a floor. And yeah, I mean, like you said, more so, I think that this kind of secures a pretty solid floor. Like this team can't fall apart like they did last, or maybe not fall apart, but like this team, I think, is a play-in team at worst. That's what I'm trying to get at. This team is not going to miss the play-in tournament, given injuries, as long as these guys can stay healthy. And again, if they can acquire somehow a starting caliber center, whether it's Clint Capella, DeAndre, and those are the guys that have been thrown out the most. If they can acquire a guy of that caliber, then I think that we can really talk about potential contending for this roster. But yeah, I mean, right now I view it more as a 7th seed and an 8th seed rather than, that 6 to 4 seed, where I think, if they can get a starting center, like I said, they could be a potential top 4, top 6 seed at the very best. So we'll see what happens regarding that starting center. But kind of to segue more into a more heavily talked about that we haven't gotten too deep into, let's talk about Dirk's Hall of Fame. His enshrinement is Saturday night, is what you said. I don't know where you can watch that. I'm assuming probably just like NBA TV or ESPN or something like that, where they're going to do the Basketball Hall of
Probably
Fame.
definitely NBA TV for sure.
Yeah, NBA TV for sure. I figured that would be a lock. So, but yeah, I mean, I don't know what time exactly, but I do know that it's Saturday night, likely on NBA TV, like I just said. But do you have any messages, or are you expecting to see anything, regarding his speech? Like, I don't know, like what are you expecting, I guess?
Yeah, obviously Dirk has always kind of been a, pretty like mild-mannered guy. He's reluctant to, always accept recognition. He wants to give it to everybody else because of how, generous he is. So with all of Dirk's post-retirement festivities, from 41-21-1 to his jersey retirement to, of course, the statue that was unveiled outside the AAC last December, expect him to be a little bit emotional, as we probably will be watching, as for Jaren and I specifically, I guess, as Gen Z Mavs fans, or whatever you want to call it. We definitely got most of our, Dirk sort of fanship from the last half of his career. And that's where we grew and evolved into, liking him, but, as well as the Mavericks. But I mean, he obviously, along with that 2011 championship run, definitely catalyzed, our fandom. I definitely think that I can speak for both of us from that perspective, just given how old we were at the time. And, back then, like being like 9 or 10 years old, you don't place a lot of stock into like what's happening on the court. None of us were paying attention to really necessarily back then. We cared, obviously about, the cool plays that were happening in the court, but we didn't have the wherewithal to analyze it or anything like that. And, just to see him ball out and see how, good of a guy he is off the court and how generous it is. I mean, it was almost weird for me, because like when I got older, I started seeing, across the league, that not all these other NBA stars are like this. Like, this guy is cut from a different cloth in terms of, not just the basketball player that he is, but the human being that he is. To be able to be a steward in the community off the court for 21 seasons in Dallas as well, still living here after coming from Germany. I mean, it's just really special. And it goes without saying that the caliber of player that he was is, as well as what he did for the Mavericks in 2011, winning one of the arguably, more impressive championships, if not in NBA history, definitely recent memory. It is more than deserving for him to be in Springfield, Massachusetts, inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. He has earned it, 1000%. And I just can't wait to see, if anybody else gets to speak on Dirk. I know Dirk will be very humble, and he'll tell some funny stories, and that'll be very good to watch. But, I would encourage anybody, as a Mavericks fan, to not miss this. Obviously, it's not the most eye-popping or grabbing sort of piece of news this summer, given, all the different things that have kind of gone on with the team, and I understand people got things going on, but if you can watch this or record it, I would definitely stress heavily too. It'll be a really cool enshrinement process. And as much as I, am not the biggest Dwayne Wade fan, and as much as I honestly dislike him, I do think it's cool that the NBA is having him and Dirk go on the same time. I hope that they don't try to, get too much fanfare and media out about their new friendship or whatever that the media is kind of trying to push, because Dirk went on, I believe 97 won the Freak with Mark Stein, and said that they're more just acquaintances than anything else. But I mean, all jokes aside, I am extremely happy Dirk is getting his flowers from this perspective, and happy that hit the last mark of his career in terms of being a Hall of Famer, of which he is 100% deserving of, is to be completed this Saturday. It would be a really cool, special moment, and I'm sure he'll finally have a little bit relief now that all of his retirement activities are essentially completed, and he's got all the accomplishments and everything. So now he can just focus on whatever post NBA ventures he wants to do. He's already an ambassador, I believe, for FIBA with Germany, and as well as his advisor role with the Mavericks. So I'm just excited for him to be able to grow up with his kids and his wife, and move on to all his other ventures, and complete the full cycle of his amazing 21-year basketball career.
Yeah, and to kind of touch up on what you said, I'll try and keep it as short as possible. But he truly is a one of one, whether it's within his community for that 21 seasons, or just on the court, whatever it was that kind of touched up on people the most. He truly did have an impact within the city. I think there's you can confidently say that there's probably not one person within the Dallas or within the DFW area who doesn't know the name Dirk Nowitzki. I can confidently say that. But also just his impact on the European game. I think that he really did bring Europe to the NBA, or bring NBA to Europe rather. I think that he was kind of the only guy, or maybe not the only guy, but I think that he was the biggest guy to do that. I think we can kind of accommodate him for bringing Giannis, bringing Luka, bringing Jokic. He's probably one of the bigger sort of guys that brought these guys over here, and we're of course only scratching the surface on European talent. But he's the guy. He's like sort of the godfather that did that. He brought all these guys over. So just his impact on the game, impact on, of course, the European game and overseas, and of course, becoming an ambassador for Germany, like you said. It's definitely something that's very impressive, and I'm excited to see what he can do in retirement now, where he can really just focus on retirement with his family, of course, like you said. And if he does want to dive back into basketball, whether it's coaching or in the front office, he already has a pseudo front office role with the Mavericks right now. I think he can confidently do that within the Mavericks organization. So I don't think that this will be the last time we see Dirk on a sort of
premium stage.
Yeah, premium stage, exactly. But I think that for at least a while it probably will be. I think he can confidently now tuck his sorrows, not tuck his sorrows, but he can tuck away into retirement and enjoy retirement at once. So I'm excited to see what he's going to do. But yeah, I mean, like I said, you can't really compose or you can't really conduce a Dirk topic into 10 minutes. It's really hard to do that. So just trying to keep it as short as possible. But yeah, I mean, he truly is a one of one.
No, 100%. And I think that, what Dirk has done for the game, like you said, in terms of, stretching it to an international level, but also, his one-legged fadeaway, obviously being a move that has been, fostered within American developmental systems. And I mean, you see like a ton of guys using it today. His impact on the game, it truly is unimaginable. So like I said, just couldn't be more happy for a guy, and there's not one more guy that could be deserving of being inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. You have anything else, Jaren, before we go ahead and end the podcast here?
Yeah, I mean, something quick. He probably doesn't remember me at all, but I can sure say that this is the coolest interaction that I had, and I honestly forgot to bring it up. But last year, I can't remember. I think it was December 7th versus the Phoenix Suns. Just a crazy event that kind of happened. I ended up on the court, and I met Dirk through the whole entire process. And kind of to speak onto his character a little bit more. I mean, I was 19 years old, just some random kid with a dream, and he doesn't, of course, remember me. He doesn't know me, but he introduced himself to me, and I got to have like a 2-minute conversation with him where I was pretty much just starstruck, didn't have any words to say other than nodding my head and pretty much drooling the whole entire time. But it was amazing, and he's a great guy, like I said. Even though he's 7 foot tall, his handshake was soft, and it wasn't like hard or firm or anything like that. So that's something to kind of speak on his character. But yeah, I mean, definitely excited to see what will happen in regards to retirement, what kind of plans he does, like I said. So congratulations to him and his family as they can finally enjoy retirement, and he can actually finally get inducted in the Hall of Fame, even though it wasn't a big process or anything like that. But yeah, I'm excited, like I said, and congratulations to them again.
Yeah, and congratulations to the Mainstream Mavs co-hosts for completing a podcast after not doing one for 10 days. So they need to get on their shit. So, but Jaren and I have been transitioning in writing for the Smoking Cuban, as you guys all know. And admittedly, we have, had a bit of an increased, amount of stuff that we're doing in regards to, that, but also with college at the moment. And I think both of us were kind of in a little bit of a shakeup for a work-life balance after, we started writing a little bit more. But, we talked it over before today's podcast after the Derrick Jones Jr. news, because, that was inevitable. We were going to do a podcast after that. And we're going to get very calculated with this and make a full roadmap of content, even throughout the, continued weeks of the off season. Even if it's dry, even if the Mavericks don't make a trade for a center before training camp, we wanted to make that a huge point of emphasis. So we'll make sure that we get a much more steady stream and ebb and flow of content out to you guys. We're going to look to at least do a podcast every other day, or, in that sort of relativity going on until training camp starts, because, it's going to be kind of thin across the margins as far as news goes until then. Even if the Mavericks, do make a trade for a center, it's not like that can dominate our, podcast topic of discussion for more than a few episodes. So we're excited to get that ready for you guys. We do encourage you guys to check out all of our content over at the Smoking Cuban, but like we said, we just kind of had to take a little bit of a step back for that, and we do apologize. We're trying our best, but we are just loser 20-year-old at the end of the day. So, we're learning how to handle all this, but we do feel a lot more confident in our approach to the podcast now. So we're excited to, be more consistent before the season starts. And I hope that's, the last time I have to say that. But anyways, for those of you guys that have been listening this far in the podcast, we do appreciate it. Make sure to check out all of our content on the Smoking Cuban, the smokingcuban.com. Like I said, Jaren and I both have articles up there. I just had one come out literally just now about Dirk's Hall of Fame enshrinement, and his teammates that'll be there. So, I mean, couldn't be a better time to plug and play an article like that, but go look at that. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter at Mainstream214. That's obviously where we're going to be posting news, rumors, updates about all things related to Mavs, as well as the off season. And make sure to follow us on our personal Twitters as well. Mine's at WillMillJ. I usually just like and retweet our podcast and our respected articles as well. But every once in a while, maybe you'll get a feisty, fiery take on there from me. I might start going 8 mode. So you never know. And you can catch Jaren's Twitter at Jaren Mavericks if you guys so please. And also make sure to get at us on YouTube, where we post the video podcasts, and you guys get to see our glorious faces and more of our mannerisms, and see just how invested we get when we're talking, because you don't get that aspect if you're just listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So if you are one of those, I'm not going to call it even a listener, but if you're one of the observers on YouTube and you are just all mainstream Mavs aficionado over there, make sure to continue our support of us. Like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. We gave you multiple options to comment down in the podcast on this episode before we got to the end. So we had to avoid, our 5-second pause of trying to think of a question. So that was definitely something we're happy about. But also make sure to get at us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Of course, we understand not everybody can listen on YouTube due to the timeliness of when you're listening to the podcast. So if you're on your way to work or something like that, we don't want you to crash and provide a wreckage on I-35 and yet another reason as to why I can't get to school next week. So make sure that you stay tuned and turn on your post notifications so you can get our podcast right away. You can listen wherever you want on Apple, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We really appreciate all the support and feedback from there. And shout out to our boy. He's going to go unnamed. He's going to go anonymous, but he started a new Twitter at Step Back Yumper. Go follow that account. There's going to be some solid NBA memes on there for those of you guys that would like to get involved in the fun side of things from the off season. And for those of you guys that are on the NBA Twitter stratosphere, he's going to be posting a lot of fun NBA memes that we'll get a good laugh. So barring that, we will catch you guys in the next episode. And this has been Will and Jaren on the Mainstream Mavs podcast. We will see you guys on Saturday.
Bye.